Hey guys, it's Madison, and today I'm checking in to share with you guys my language learning progress for the first 3 months of the year. In the past, I've only done like annual checkups on my language learning, and that's because I set yearly goals, so it makes sense to check in at the end of the year and just see how much I accomplished. But this year, I decided to jump on the trend of doing quarterly updates, partly because by the end of the year, it's so hard to actually remember what you felt like in your language learning journey at the beginning of the year. And then also because this year I've been so good at keeping track of the exact amount of time I've spent on language learning and also the activities that I've done on language learning. So I have a lot of fun graphs and charts, which, as you guys probably know, I love. And so I figured it'd be fun to share them with you at smaller intervals rather than throwing a bunch of graphs and data at you all at once at the end of the year. So that's why I'm here today. And yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and start off with the big exciting numbers, and that is the total amount of language learning / exposure I've done total for all my languages so far in the first 3 months. And that is 164 hours and 59 minutes. So 1 minute away from 165 hours. So I'm just gonna say 165 hours in the first 3 months of the year, which is honestly way more than I expected. And if you break that down by language, that is 96 hours and 22 minutes of Korean, 55 hours and 38 minutes of Mandarin, and 12 hours and 59 minutes, aka 13 hours of Japanese. So overall, just looking at the total numbers so far, 1 quarter into the year, I am extremely happy with where I am, and hopefully I can continue on this track. But let's go ahead and get into the monthly breakdown. Now for January, at the end of January, I went ahead and posted a in-depth breakdown already of what I did. So if you're interested in seeing that with more fun graphs and stats and that kind of stuff, you can go ahead and check out that video. But overall in January, I got 50 hours and 7 minutes of language learning for my 3 languages, with 14 hours and 17 minutes of that being active language learning time. As far as the language breakdown, very briefly, it was kind of evenly split between Mandarin and Korean, with a little bit of Japanese thrown in for the overall time. But when you consider just active time, it was definitely Korean dominant, with Japanese in second and Mandarin actually in third. And in that last video where I broke down January's numbers, I remember saying that 50 hours was incredible for me. Like, I honestly don't typically get that much time. January was one of my months off for my long winter vacation, and so that's part of the reason why. But that number was blown out of the water once I got to February, which had a total time of 80 hours and 22 minutes. 80 hours in the shortest month of the year. Absolutely mind-boggling. And funnily enough, if I had to rank the 3 months so far about how good I felt about my language learning, February was definitely at the bottom, even though I had the most time. And if you look at the monthly graph for what I did each day, you can probably notice that there's a few days that stand out with extremely high numbers, and the scale is really skewed. If you see the top line, there is 24 hours, which is a full day. And that top line, the 2 top lines actually are around the 18-hour mark, which is bonkers. And the reason for that is because, as you might guess, those were drama binging days. And for both of them, actually, I didn't do 18 hours out of the 24-hour day, really. The way I keep track of my language learning time is that I count it as a certain day until I go to bed. And on those 2 particular days, I kind of stayed up all night or almost all night because I was addicted to whatever show I was watching and kept clicking next way into the wee hours of the morning. And once again, this is a vacation month, so I was capable of doing that without screwing over my work schedule. And so yeah, I had a couple days where I made some bad decisions and spent an extremely wild amount of time watching dramas. And that is what led to such an insanely high number of 80 hours and 22 minutes in the shortest month of the year. And if you look at just the active time, you can see why I felt so bad about February, and that is because it was kind of a desert of not very much language learning throughout the whole month, with a total of 9 hours and 46 minutes of active study time out of 80 hours and 22 minutes total. 9 hours. That is not super great. And over 5.5 hours of that was in the first 3 days of the month. So after that, I definitely got on a lazy streak. And there's even basically a 2-week period where I did absolutely no active learning at all. And so, yeah, I just got in one of those moods where I didn't really feel like learning languages. And also at the end of this month is when I was going back to my job. The vacation was ending. And so part of that dead time at the end there was just prepping for my job starting back up the new semester and having to teach, lesson prepping, that kind of stuff. And then also before the semester starts, there's lots of events that I have to go to at school as well. And so I was just distracted by life stuff in addition to kind of being in a slump of motivation anyways. And so yeah, despite the crazy high overall numbers because of some binge watching of dramas, this definitely was the lowest productivity month in terms of actually studying my 3 languages. And yeah, if you break down by language as well, you can see that Korean by far was the highest time spent in a language amongst the 3 of them, regardless of if you look at overall time or active study time. So yeah, that was my February. Weirdly high numbers for a weirdly low productivity month. And that leads us into March, which had the lowest overall time, but actually I felt the best about out of the 3 months overall. I had a total of 35 hours exactly in March for overall language exposure time, which was pretty good for a couple of reasons. Number one, I was back to working full time, and so obviously the amount of time I had in a week to work on languages or watch content or whatever was significantly decreased. And then also, if you look at the active studying time, it was 17 hours and 45 minutes, which is just over half of the overall hours of the month, which is an insanely high percentage of active study time for me. And not only was just the number of hours of active study time high, but it was also very consistent. If you look at the monthly graph, you can see that almost every single day of the month, I was doing at least a little bit of active learning, and it felt just really good, honestly, to have that high consistency rate of active learning. It's pretty unusual for me, to be totally honest, and it's one of my goals in general is to be more consistent in my language learning, especially active learning. If you look at the language breakdown for the overall time, it's actually a majority of Mandarin, followed pretty closely by Korean, and then way in last place is Japanese, which is pretty difficult for me. Part of the reason that Mandarin beat out Korean is because I did binge watch a Mandarin show or 2 this month, as you can see in the monthly breakdown on a weekend, which kind of skews the entire graph's scale a little bit. But when you take out all of the passive time, you can see that Korean edges into first place out of my 3 languages again, but it's still a pretty even split between Mandarin and Korean. So yeah, that is how we get to 165 hours for the first 3 months. If you look at a graph of all those 3 months put together, definitely those couple of binge watching days in February stand out by a long shot and definitely skew the entire graph down a little bit, making all of my normal study days look a little bit paltry. But still, I'm very happy with how the first 3 months have gone overall. If you look at it big picture like this, you can see that almost every day out of the first 3 months, I spent some time doing languages in some way, either actively or just passively. And honestly, that's the biggest thing for me, is having languages be a constant part of my life. And so I'm very happy with that. And then if you look at the active studying time overall 3 months in a chart, again, even though there are a little bit of longer periods of non-activity for the active learning time, aside from a few little chunks in January where I was with my family, and in February during that one little slump, honestly, it's been pretty consistent as far as active learning goes as well. And so I am super, super pumped about that. And I'm really hoping that I can kind of carry that on forwards into the next 3 quarters of the year. So yeah, over the first 3 months, out of the 165 total hours of language learning and exposure, active time accounts for 41 hours and 48 minutes, with the majority of that being Korean once again. It's actually kind of interesting to see if you compare the language breakdown for the total overall time versus just the active time for the first 3 months, how similar the language breakdowns actually are. Like Korean is almost exactly the same, and the other 2 categories change only slightly. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But yeah, that's the first 3 months of the year in terms of time. But if you recall way back to my goals video, I actually didn't set any time goals, and I still am not the kind of person who wants to set time goals because then I get too in my head about the specifics of the goal. It's funny because a lot of like goal setting advice is to set like specific and measurable goals, but for me, I honestly stress myself out way too much when I do that. And so for big picture yearly goals, I tend to set more general goals, not so much of specific or measurable goals, especially with time. I can't. The second I feel behind in the time goal, I just kind of get in a motivation slump and do nothing for a long time. So that doesn't work for me. Instead, I just like to just look at the time afterwards like I have been doing and be like, wow, look at that, that's interesting. So I prefer looking in hindsight at my time and not setting goals for the future for my time. But for the goals that I did set, again, I'm only a quarter of the way through the year, so I still have time to work towards my goals, but just looking very generally at what I've done so far. As far as Mandarin and Japanese go, my primary goal was just to study more consistently throughout the year, and my way of measuring that was trying to actively study at least a few days every single month. And yes, technically I have achieved that. I would say I'm doing much better in terms of Mandarin compared to Japanese. For Japanese, I have studied at least 3 or 4 days actively every single month, but I actually don't think I've studied more than 3 or 4 days in any given month so far, so it's definitely not super consistently a part of my life, even though it is technically barely meeting the goal that I set for myself. So hopefully in the future I can spend a little more time on Japanese, and that's especially clear if you look at the graph for overall active study time so far. Yellow is by far the least visible color on the graph. Mandarin actually started out similarly infrequent at the beginning of the year, but starting in March, you can see that I was much more actively studying Chinese on an almost daily basis for quite a good bit. And so recently I've definitely been doing a pretty good job of actively studying Mandarin fairly regularly, so I'm pretty happy with that so far. As for Korean, I'm doing kind of okay on my goals. I'm pretty close to achieving my goal of 1 book per month. I read a book in January and February, and I almost read a full book in March. I also watched several news broadcasts in February, I believe. That was before my little slump. And so I also worked a little bit on my goal to getting more kind of formal and wide vocabulary, both through the news and also my reading. I just still feel like I could actually read more in my life in Korean. I definitely have the time for it if I just spent more time working on that goal versus mindlessly watching YouTube every single day. I tend to, at the end of the month, be like, oh yeah, I wanted to read a book every month, and so I kind of go and read one in a few days at the end of the month, and so hopefully I can work it more into my regular schedule as opposed to kind of throwing it in there at the end of the month. But at least I'm reading at the end of the month, so it is at least motivating me, I guess, so that's the bright side of that. And I definitely could watch more news. Still, I only kind of did one little session of that so far this year over a few days, and so I could work that more into my life. As far as the social goals go, I'm definitely failing them so far, not going to lie. It's abysmal. I had the rough goal to travel once a month, and I've only traveled once so far. At the end of February, I traveled down to Daegu to visit my old close friends there, which was super fun, super great, and a very Korean-filled day. But beyond that, I haven't traveled anywhere really, which honestly, I'm kind of excusing myself for, which I probably shouldn't, but I am, because it's been pretty cold and miserable outside, and I don't like the cold. And so I'm already a homebody and someone who doesn't like leaving the house very much anyways. And so when you add to that cold weather, it's really hard for me to convince myself to go outside in those conditions. And also I was in the States for the first half of January, so that also limited my chances to travel in January. But now that it is warming up and finally is springtime, I will have more opportunities and more motivation, hopefully, to go outside and do things outside of my home. And same for socializing, because a lot of the same reasons. I haven't really found the motivation to push myself to go get involved in things because, again, it's so miserable and cold outside that I haven't really wanted to force myself to go out any more than I have to for work. And so I haven't done much so far, but now that it is getting warmer, I have actually made some plans and looked into some things I can get involved in. So stay tuned for that in the future. I have plans, and hopefully that will be going much better starting next quarter. So even though I'm failing miserably on those accounts, I am at least eyeing some opportunities in the future to make it better. So yeah, that is overall my breakdown for my language goals, successes and failures so far for this year. I feel like if we overlook the utter failure of the social goals, I feel like I'm doing pretty good so far for all of my other goals that I set for myself. I feel like I'm doing pretty well, studying more consistently than I expected in general and for more time overall than I expected. And so hopefully I can keep it up and continue this generally good momentum into the next quarter, adding in some social stuff as well and hopefully some travel too. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say for this little update video. Hope you guys enjoyed it and I will see you guys next time. Annyeong.